into our attention. Okay. So to sort of continue in a trend set by Irene and Paulo and Dan, let's have a little bit of a group discussion first. So get together in a group, right, and think about a situation in your life where you've had to wait in order to get something, and then think about why you had to wait. What it would be if instead of waiting, that would be, auctioned off, or money was used instead of the wait, and how you feel about that. Okay, so take a few minutes, talk to your neighbors about this, and let's get our thoughts together.
Can you repeat your question?
Think about a situation where you've had to wait in order to get something, and why you had to wait, and what it would be like if you instead had to pay for it, and what you think about that situation. What's your view of that situation?
Thank you.
When I came there, like 6:30, no one I was there. I was
All right. So, any examples? Yes, go ahead.
I was waiting to be admitted to the
PhD program. Okay.
But
excellent.
Waiting at another program, I was admitted that without funding for the first year, and waiting for the funding there.
Yeah.
So there is a little bit of a sense where you have like a price mechanism there. So I could have gone to that other one.
Okay.
If I was willing to.
The alternative to waiting would have been to auction off the PhD program slot, right? Okay. Anybody else?
Wait, is it right, or is it to resolve the uncertainty in this case?
It could have been to resolve the uncertainty in this case, yeah. But I was kind of making a joke. Any other ideas? Yes, go ahead.
Visa appointments.
Visa appointments. Okay.
I would be happy to pay for like that.
You'd be happy to pay for it, right? And like, maybe some people, had this experience where they missed out on a trip because of the visa appointments, right? So it's not getting auctioned off, but there's a waiting. Yes.
Some other countries do that. You can pay more and get a visa decision faster.
Some countries allow you to do that. Okay, great.
The UK has 3 such options. You
The
pay more and you get more reduced time.
You get reduced time, exactly. Any other examples?
Detox, going for roller coasters, then you can pay more and go to the court shoes.
Yeah, sometimes you have this like fast lane, VIP lane, but usually you want people to usually people have to wait in line. Okay, so I mean everybody's waited in line at some point, right? Okay, And why do we do this? Why do we have, visa appointments where there isn't a price? Tonight at the taco truck, you'll have to wait for your tacos, right? The alternative is to auction it off potentially, right? What would you guys think about that? Or, to play favorites and give some people the VIP taco ticket and other people the regular taco ticket, right? So there's some fairness considerations, right? That prevent you from waiting. There are some like legal restrictions on using prices, in-kind transfers where you don't want to use prices, and waiting tends to be a common mechanism. There's a lot like a fairness type of thing involved into this, right? Later in the second half of this talk, I'm going to talk about organ allocation, right? And that's a common waitlist mechanism. So let's have a show of hands. How many of you would be okay if we sold hair, or like people who were donating hair were paid in lieu of hair? You'd be okay with it?
There's actually a market for it.
There is a market for it. Okay, good. What if there was a market for kidneys? How many of you would be okay with paying people to donate their kidneys? 4, 5, 6, not so many, right? Okay, what are your objections? Any objections to having a market for kidneys?
Well, I've heard that in China and in other countries like India, that they're so expensive that people get abducted and they cut the kidneys out. So it creates some bad incentive.
Okay, yeah, there's crime that could if there's a valuable thing like that. But if maybe you would say, somebody would say that if there was a well-functioning market where the price of kidneys wasn't so high, maybe the federal government was buying it, then maybe that wouldn't happen. Any other objections?
But I guess typically you think that people in need with like low income would disproportionately give their kidneys, and it might be in situations where they might be kind of forced.
They feel coerced, right? And then it kind of erodes limited liability and bankruptcy. I think maybe there'd be debt against your kidneys, right? If you had a market for kidneys, then you could take debt with your kidney as a collateral, and that erodes limited liability considerations. I mean, yeah, go ahead.
Asymmetric information. So it's well known that some people can live with one kidney, so that could be given as a reason, but the quality of life is severely impacted. And
well, most of us have 2 kidneys, and most of us are going to be okay with one of them. So, and asymmetric information can be mitigated with doctors and so on. How many? Okay, yeah, go ahead.
So I guess on a continuum, we don't have any problem with people giving blood.
Yeah, there's payment for plasma.
We can't give our hearts or our livers. So what is it about a kidney that makes it different from blood?
I don't know. Blood regenerates, perhaps. Kidneys don't regenerate, perhaps. I'm not sure, but
It doesn't regenerate.
sorry. but I'm not entirely certain. But yeah, go ahead.
Pharmaceutical companies might be less likely to develop artificial kidneys if there's a well-functioning market. Or
okay, potentially, depending on what the price would be of in that market, right? Okay, how many of you are just uncomfortable with the idea of objectifying organs? That's usually what most humans would think, that there's something uncomfortable about objectifying human body parts, right? And in all countries except the Republic of Iran, it's illegal to buy and sell solid organs for transplantations. Okay, so it happens to be the case that for a variety of reasons, prices are restricted in many areas, and then we use things like weighting. We use things like weighting because of fairness considerations and so on. And so, how would we think about designing these systems? What are the potential costs of weighting? Why don't we do what John suggested and have a victory auction? So I'm going to start with some of the simple theory to try and explain what's different between weighting as a screening device. I think there was another comment in Dan's talk about, potentially there's some screening value of weighting. It's up there as well. How to think about that? The different types of weighting mechanisms that we commonly see. There are lots of examples I'm sure you guys came up with that weren't, we didn't elevate to the discussion here, but maybe think about those examples in the context of this theory. And then we're going to think about deceased donor kidney allocation, where there are reasons why we don't necessarily buy and sell organs. Okay. So waiting can be costly, right? Waiting can be costly. Literally standing in line can be costly because your time is valuable and you're not doing other things, right? So that is a literal cost of waiting. There's also the potential for the value of the object decreasing if you wait longer, right? So if you wait longer for a kidney, maybe there are other organ systems that are taking a toll, and so the value of the ultimate transplant is worse potentially. Okay, and this using waiting as a screening device is different from using money as a screening device, because waiting is costly from a social perspective, and this is why John wanted to have an auction instead. When you have a price, if I auction off the taco tickets, then you pay me for those tickets, right? The right to wait, right? And so you don't have to wait in line anymore. Okay, and so that socially costly thing that you have to do by waiting in line suddenly goes away. Okay, and the socially costly thing of waiting in line happens not only in like in-kind transfer things. Some of you might have waited in line for the first iPhone or the first Xbox, right? So or the first Harry Potter, or when the Harry Potter book came out, you had to wait in line if you wanted to get it first, right? So there are lots of cases where even companies make people wait. Okay, so what happens? What are the economics of using waiting, and why is it potentially costly, and why might you still sometimes want to use it? Okay, so I'm going to take a nice paper by Condorelli that takes basically the setup of a standard mechanism design problem and modifies it a little bit to think about waiting. Okay, so imagine that there are m objects with quality xj, where j indexes the quality of the object. Okay, so j plus 1 is a higher quality object than xj. Agents are, there are n agents indexed by I. They have valuations that are distributed f sub I. And there's some quasi-linear utility function where there's a cost is in waiting. Okay, so if you have to wait ci, then that's the cost of waiting, and that's money burnt. Instead of waiting being transferred to the person who's selling you the object, it's burnt. Okay, so waiting is the same thing as taking a bunch of money and burning it. There's no difference. Okay, so the value of the agent is vi times xi, where xi is the object that is assigned to the agent, and then ci is burnt. Okay, so let's try to implement this using a direct mechanism. In a direct mechanism, you tell me your type. I will tell you the probability that you will be assigned to each of the objects. So Pij is the probability that agent I is assigned to object J, and the agent will have to pay some waiting cost Ci. Okay, so the mechanism is designing these two objects. And then if I report Si, my interim utility is Vi times the expectation over what the other agents are going to report of Xij times the probability that I get each of the objects minus the expected waiting costs. Okay, this looks pretty much like standard mechanism design. The only thing that's different is that C is going to get burnt as opposed to transferred to somebody else. Okay, and so because it's exactly like standard mechanism design, you would find that if you put together the local incentive compatibility constraints, you'll see that a direct mechanism is incentive compatible if and only if you have a higher type, if you report a higher type, then you have a higher probability of assignment, where Pi is the vector of assignments, and the order is that there is a stochastic order, so that you're more likely to get assigned every object of a higher order, okay, of a higher quality. And the cost of waiting, the expected cost of waiting, given your report Vi, is given by this formula, which should be very familiar from standard mechanism design. Okay, so far so good. So far, it does not look very different from standard mechanism design. Okay, now because money is burnt, the objective function is a bit different. That's where weighting comes in. The objective function of the planner is to take the welfare weights WI of each agent and multiply it by the value of the object they get minus the cost of weighting. Okay, because weight is not a transfer, it is a cost to society. That's the only difference now. Okay, so the first best in this simple model is not implementable. That's the first result in the paper, unless n-1 or n-m agents have 0 Pareto weights and the object's identical. The first best would be no weight and give it to the give the highest quality object to the person who values it the most, etc. Okay. Now people have private information and they value these objects, so everybody wants the higher quality object, and so the first best is not implementable unless you only care about one person's welfare. Okay. So already we have a stark departure from standard mechanism design results, where first best is implementable. Okay, so now when is it that weighting makes sense? Okay, well, the weight must be worth it, essentially. So is it worth the weight? So what does the optimal mechanism look like? The optimal mechanism is going to allocate the objects to agents with the highest marginal contribution to social surplus. As I said, that's sort of the same as standard mechanism design again, right? Highest marginal contribution to social surplus, but the marginal contribution to social surplus looks a bit different now. If take the hazard rate of with every agent's valuation FI, sorry, distribution valuation FI, you can take the hazard rate of that distribution, right? So Harry yesterday talked to you about survival functions, or Dave yesterday about survivor functions, etc. You can think of the hazard rate of that distribution. Okay. If the hazard rates are non-decreasing, then the social the value of the marginal contribution of social surplus of agent I is their Pareto weight times the expected value of the object to that agent. You know, agents are drawing valuation from different distributions, so expected VI may not be the same for everybody, and the weight, the welfare weight might be different, right? But in the special case where all the welfare weights are the same and all of the agents have the same expected value, the optimal mechanism is to have a random allocation. That is to not screen using weighting at all, because the cost of weighting via the screening is not worth it. You're going to burn too much money. Okay. A third corollary in the paper is that if the hazard rates are decreasing, and I'll give you intuition for why why the constant hazard rate is the sort of cutoff. If the hazard rates are decreasing, then the priority functions are the welfare weights times something like the function of the hazard rates. Okay. So what's going on? So think about the exponential distribution. The exponential distribution is constant hazard rates, right? And it has the property that conditional on having a value of the distribution that's above a particular value, you just take that number and you add the mean to the value, and that's the expected value, right? So suppose I told you that you have to wait 10 hours for something, okay, and you had the exponential distribution in wait time equivalence, right? And the mean valuation was five hours worth of, that was your valuation in waiting time units. If I told you that you have to wait 10 hours for this, you'd only wait if your valuation is above 10 hours, right? And the expected value conditional on you wanting to wait 10 hours is 15 hours. Okay, so the 10 hours was burnt. And relative to just giving it to you without making you wait, I didn't learn anything new because the surplus is 5 hours still. Okay, when the hazard rate is decreasing, the expectation conditional on you having waited 10 hours is much higher than 5. Okay, so it's only worth the wait if the dispersion in valuation is really high, so that these still people who really want to get the object. Okay, and so if you were waiting in line for the Xbox or for the first Harry Potter book, the night that it was revealed, you must have a really, really high valuation. And it could be worth it if the people who really want that are the super fans who care about it a lot more than the average person. Sometimes, often you don't want to wait. And that's why a standard, a first instinct of an economist is to say waiting is costly. Okay, but in this paper, it shows you that depending on the valuation, there are some cases where if you are banned from using waiting for other reasons, you might want to do it. Okay. So with that said, we often don't see, so that's one kind of case where you want to have waiting. With that said, often the mechanisms that we do see in practice look quite different from that type of mechanism that I just told you about, where there's a waiting time as a function of the quality that's posted and you decide which one you want to take. What you often see is something like a first come, first serve system. Who's come across a first come, first serve waiting list, where the person who's first in line is the one who gets to go first. Right? I mean, it's like the thing that you think is fair. You showed up there first, you should get it for the visa appointments, etc. Okay, so there are a number of cases where you see waiting lists. And there are a number of papers that talk about it. One of the papers is going to be the adoption of kids from foster care. That's going to be in the conference program, and you'll see how that works out. Okay, so in these waitlist mechanisms, there are sometimes priorities over potential applicants, and these priorities are going to determine who gets offered the object first when it arrives, but it's often just based on first come, first serve. So let's think about the canonical waitlist procedure, the first come, first serve procedure, and let's think about potential rationales for why you might want to have the system in place. Okay, so Block and Kantala is this nice paper that talks about when is it the case that first come, first serve is efficient. Okay, so time is discrete, agents are indexed by I. Okay, an object arrives each period and must be allocated immediately. People have valuations drawn from some distribution F that's bounded by theta lower bar and theta upper bar, or maybe 0 and 1. There's a per period cost of waiting C, and the waitlist size is constant. So whenever somebody comes in and whenever an object shows up and gets assigned, somebody else also joins the list at the back to kind of make the thing optimal. Okay, so Block and Kantala are going to look at a broad class of mechanisms, a relatively broad class of mechanisms, which may not be only first come, first serve, but preserve some kind of priority structure that let I be your index of when you arrived. Okay, if you arrive before me, you're more likely to be served before me. Okay, so there's some probability over sequences in which you are going to be offered the object. You can choose to accept or decline it, and that offer sequence will maintain some monotonicity. Okay, and I'll tell you exactly what that is. But now let's think about your decision, right, of whether to accept this object or not. Okay, so let's say that your rank on the current list is I, so that there are I-1 people ahead of you on the list. Okay, let's think about your value function, conditional on you being in the ith position. Okay, if the objects are offered as they arrive to the first, I-1 people, if somebody in that first I-1 positions accepts the object, then you get upgraded to position I-1. Okay, so that's the first term in your value function. These shouldn't be equals, they should be pluses. Apologies. Okay, so these two things should be pluses. Plus, if everybody else rejects it ahead of you, then you get to potentially accept it. If you accept it and you use the threshold rule theta I, then you get the expected value of the object conditional on accepting it. And if it's not accepted by you, then you remain in the same position and you pay the cost of waiting. Okay, and the valuation of the objects are drawn IID. So a few observations. The first is that when people ahead of you reject the object, it's not a negative signal about the object because we've made this IID assumption. Okay, we made this assumption that my preferences and your preferences are not correlated. So it doesn't mean that this is a bad thing and that is why you didn't accept it. It's just that our preferences are different. In the common values case, it's very different. If all of us agree on the valuation of the object, then the fact that you said no means that this is a bad object. Okay?
So if we agree and we have imperfect information, that I don't know what is exactly.
Yes, and so once you want, if it's common values, and once you say no, I know that there must be a threshold that says that was your acceptance threshold, and the value of the object is below that threshold. Okay. So Block and Cantala show that in their model with this IID shock, right, the IID preferences, if your queue is monotone, in the sense that if you're ahead of me in line, then you're more likely to be offered the object first. May not be sometimes offered first. In all of those classes of mechanisms, first come first serve is the best mechanism. Okay, as long as there's some priority for being first, you should use the first come first serve mechanism. Okay, either on the private values or the binary values. Okay. The second thing is that if there's common values, okay, then waste is going to be higher under first come first serve. So what's basically happening? If you're the first person on the list, you can be very selective. Why can you be very selective? Well, you know, if you say no, you're going to be offered the object again first, or whatever object comes up next first. So your continuation value is really high. And your continuation value is really high, and you're likely to say no. The second person on the list, well, this person has a lower continuation value because if an object shows up, the first person might take it, and so their expected wait time is longer. But their continuation value is higher than the third person on the list, and so on. Okay, so in some sense, first come first serve induces people, at least at the top of the list, to be quite selective. Okay, now let's contrast this with something else. So let me say one more thing. So in this system, there are basically two externalities from declining an offer. First, when I decline an offer, what I allow other people to do is to accept that offer. And because they can accept that offer, I have a positive externality because I'm potentially reducing people's waiting time. Okay. But by declining, I am going to stay on the list. And that means that I'm going to take away future offers. And that's a negative externality on people who are behind me on the list. Okay. And so by sort of controlling, by changing the queuing discipline, I can potentially incentivize people to be selective in different ways and potentially manage these two externalities. So let me give you a stark example. In Su and Xenios, they show that the last come first serve mechanism is the best mechanism if everybody has the same valuation. Let's think about why for a second. So let's go back to Paulo's example, where you and I all have the same value for the object, and we don't want to wait. Okay, so I'm the first person on the list. Sorry, I just arrived on the list. So it's last come first serve. So I'm going to be the first person to be offered the object. Okay. If I say no, then what's going to happen? What are the risks that I face? The risk is that somebody else shows up tomorrow. And if somebody else shows up tomorrow before the object arrives, then I'll be second on the list and I'll only get their seconds. I'll only get their leftovers. Okay. And their leftovers are not so good. Why are their leftovers not so good? Because we all agree on what's good. Let's say Paulo arrives tomorrow. He's going to cream skim, and I'll be left with whatever he passes on. So that induces me to be less selective as compared to the first come first serve mechanism. And in the case where we all agree on exactly what the valuation of the object is, it doesn't matter who gets it. Okay, it's the valuation from the social balance perspective is all the same. All I want to do is to reduce waste. So what I want to do is make people reduce the selectivity as much as possible. And last come first serve does that really effectively, because when you're near the bottom of the list, there's really a gun to your head, because if you don't accept something, you're just getting declined and you're getting demoted more and more on the list. More and more people are ahead of you. Okay, so managing these incentives is exactly what you need to do. Okay.
You, with last come first serve, run the risk of a kind of unravel. Like I'm just imagining playing this game with a group of people. Nobody would actually want to get in line and commit. You know, if
Yeah, so Arnav's asking, these two mechanisms have very different incentives on when you want to join the list. Okay, in the first come first serve, you want to rush to join the list as soon as possible because that's how you maintain priority. In last come first serve, you want to join the list just before something great comes along. Okay, as long as, but if you don't know that, maybe that doesn't work so well, right? Like if you have information about whether something good is going to come up, then you maybe want to join the list at that point. Okay. Yeah.
So maybe I missed this. What happens if it's not perfectly common? So there's correlation,
Yeah.
like affiliated.
Right. So the unfortunately, I'm going to say I don't know. Here's why I'll say I don't know. These mechanisms are extremely complicated to analyze. They're not that easy. Leshno changes the mechanism, the primitives just a little bit. There are two types of objects, A and B. The types alpha and beta. Alphas want A, betas want Bs, and they comes up with a very different type of mechanism. Okay, so it's very difficult to get general results in this space. Okay, and that's going to be one of my messages. That as opposed to the beautiful theory of auctions, in dynamic allocation mechanisms, there are very few results that are general, and they're very specific to the allocation system.
It would seem like in kidneys that folks of certain blood types are going to be, it's going to seem, or it seems to me, I have no medical training, that if
Yeah.
you're a type O or something like that in terms of organs, you're going to be, people of that type are going to be better matched than others.
Yeah. So Harry is pointing out that, these are kind of very extreme stylized examples. The real world is probably much more like there are good kidneys and bad kidneys, but there's also match quality. It might be because of your blood type. It might be because of other things, maybe the size and weight of the person and the size and weight of the person who's in livers, for example, you need a liver that is big enough so that it can, it has adequate capacity to process the toxins in your body, right? And so there's a height and weight match. And yeah, the world is complicated. And so that all I'm going to say is we have to go about thinking about the empirics of what the distribution of valuations looks like in each context to think about this, because just these stylized examples, these polar examples where people have IID preferences or people have common values gave you two completely different looking mechanisms, right? With IID valuations, you saw that first come first serve was amazing. With common values, you saw that last come first serve was amazing. I can't think of two polar differences in terms of what the mechanism looks like. So we'd have to go about thinking about what that distribution looks like.
So I don't know this literature, but in this literature, if you think back to say Milgram and Holmstrom, they note that they essentially invoke the Wilson critique, namely that the construction of the optimal auction hinges critically on
distribution of
types.
Yeah.
And then they play this game against nature, where nature is in some sense being nasty. And
yeah.
They show that linear contracts are the best response to that environment. Has anyone done that in this literature?
No, not that I know. Yeah, it's hard to get robust designs in this space. Okay, so now let's talk about the optimal replacement of kidneys instead of bus engines. So what we're going to think about is the deceased donor kidney allocation system, which works via Waitlist. What happens, so right now there are about 100,000 patients who are waiting for a life-saving organ transplant, usually kidneys. I mean, almost 100,000 people on kidneys. Many patients remain untransplanted each year, and thousands wait while dying. And about 2/3 of the potential kidneys for transplantation are sourced from deceased donors. Out of the 100,000 patients, we're going to only get in combination of deceased and living donors, we're going to get about 19,000 transplants a year. Okay, and another 35,000 patients joining the kidney list. Okay, so demand vastly outstrips supply in this case. Okay, at the same time, about 20% of medically suitable kidneys are discarded. Okay, and so improving the allocation can potentially help these patients, help get better matches, and is an important policy question. Right now, the kidney allocation system is undergoing a potential reform. So the authorities are thinking about how to reform the system. It's a prototypical dynamic assignment problem in the following sense. So if you're on this waiting list, what happens is that when a deceased donor organ shows up, the patients on the list are ordered according to some priority rule. That is not first come, first serve, strictly speaking. It has some features of first come, first serve, but it is not first come, first serve. They're going to consider things like match quality, etc., in determining who should get offered the organ first. Okay, and so you as a patient, along with the consultation of your surgeon, have the option to say no when an organ is offered. Okay. In the meantime, you're living on dialysis, which is an artificial kidney that you're hooked up. It's not a very pleasant thing to do. 3 times a week, 4 hours a time, you have to be hooked up to a machine that's going to circulate your blood and cleanse it. Okay, so you can accept or decline, and then once you accept, that's an optimal stopping problem. Why? Because you accept, and you get the transplant, and you're removed from the list. Okay, so instead of being a renewal action, it's a stopping problem. Okay, but otherwise it looks a lot like the bus engine problem. Okay, and there are similar rationing mechanisms for other organs and so on. So this is a paper that I'm going to talk about, which is with Paolo Samani, Dan Waldinger, a transplant surgeon. That's another thing that market designers do sometimes. Co-author with a person who's a practitioner in the field. It really gives you some detailed institutional knowledge that you can use to learn a lot about the setup and have a model that hopefully more closely captures reality. Although Dr. Rees wasn't necessarily always happy with all of the assumptions. And with Itai Ashlagi at Stanford as well. From the agent's perspective, so we're going to do this again. It's a dynamic game now. Okay, it's a game because there are all these 100,000 patients on the waiting list, and you can say yes or no. If you say yes, then you get the transplant, you're off the list. If you say no, then you're on the list, and you potentially exert this externality on other people because you may take future organs. And so there's these same externalities that I talked about in the simple theory that will show up here. Okay, and so we got this data from the kidney allocation system in New York City. There's a centralized system that runs this allocation process as a computer algorithm, and that generates all of the offers, the decisions, and has detailed information on patients and donors, like their blood type, some medical conditions, etc. Okay, and so we get this, and we're going to use CCP methods, which you learned about earlier in the summer school, to try and estimate the preferences for various kidneys. And then we'll do counterfactual evaluations where we're going to try to solve the equilibria of these games. And we'll think about what other mechanisms you could use and what are the equilibria of those mechanisms, and think about what that implies for the types of assignments that you get, right? Now, this in the OPTN, which is the body that administers the kidney assignment system, used some simulation methods in the past to simulate the kidney system in order to try and get at what different reforms would do. But they weren't thinking about the idea that when you change the mechanism, people's behavior in that mechanism is going to change. And they kept their choice processes constant. And so they estimate a static model, etc. So this paper is contributing a dynamic framework in order to do that type of simulation. Okay, and compute equilibria. And as I argued earlier, the nature of preference is kind of important. All right, the few general results on the theory of optimal dynamic mechanism design, and the scope for empirical work. Okay, so we're going to take data prior to 2014 in order to, in this exercise, in this paper, that's what we did. It had sort of coarse priority types, patients who had a perfect tissue type match with a potential donor were prioritized. So we now know a lot about antibodies and antigens after going through the pandemic, right? So if a foreign body enters, a foreign object, foreign proteins enters your body, your body mounts an immune response, okay? And so when a kid, as opposed to the COVID spike protein, if a kidney is inside your body is going to start mounting an immune response. If it was a twin's kidney, however, your body's immune system, unless you have autoimmune disease, would not really think of it as a foreign object, right? And so if the tissue type matches, so the surface proteins of the kidney that is transplanted to you are very similar to your own surface proteins, then the immune response is going to be very, very low. And you're going to live longer without immunosuppression drugs, okay? So those guys were prioritized because those kidneys are going to last for long in your body. And then after that, there was local, regional, national matching. There was points for various things, points for how long you wait. That's the first come, first serve like aspect where you're prioritized if you waited longer. Hard to match patients were prioritized because they had few options. Pediatric patients were prioritized because we care for the young. And there was a change in 2014 that attempts to improve match quality by various means. There's a proposed change coming up that is supposed to be implemented in 2024. We'll see when it actually happens. And so there are a number of factors that affect the value of an organ transplant, how biologically compatible it is with you. That's a binary thing. If, for example, you already have a pre-existing immune reaction to the kidney, you will not be even offered it. Okay. And then, a good quality donor would be valuable. And you might want to wait. You might say, look, I don't want to take this kidney because if I wait a little bit, I'll get more priority and I'll get a better kidney. Okay. Okay. Any questions about the institutional details, how the system works? Yeah.
Isn't getting kidney like binary from the point that I have it doesn't filter my blood and I'm good?
There are good filters and bad filters. There are filters that are appropriately sized for you and not. And then there are filters that your body is going to attack because it thinks of it as a foreign object. And there are filters that it won't, right? So if the filter doesn't fit really well, then it's not quite, there's a quality of the filter essentially. Okay, so think about it like this, okay? I was talking to Harry the other day. The ideal donor is somebody who had a head injury in a motorcycle crash or something like that, and is otherwise pretty young, okay, and was running marathons before that death. But people die in many ways, and death does bad things to your organs, right? So not everybody will have an organ that is going to be as good. Maybe the person had diabetes or something else like that, okay? By the way, if you don't remember anything else from this talk, please remember to drink water. It preserves your kidneys. Okay, so, all right, so the data is going to be from the OPTN, which runs the assignment mechanism. And in the study, we're going to take data from the New York area between 2010 and 2013. And we're going to look at, the New York City area, which is, it serves New York City plus Long Island plus some neighboring counties, right? So it's like the largest donor service area in the United States, okay? That uses standard allocation rules. There are some areas that use somewhat different rules. And as I said, we have detailed donor and patient characteristics. So there are going to be lots of methodological challenges, right? So the first methodological challenge is going to be the identification of counterfactuals. So if you remember the lecture from 2 days ago, when you do these dynamic problems, these models are somewhat under-identified essentially, okay, non-parametrically. You have to normalize. I don't like to use the word normalize because it's not always without loss. The payoff from a particular action in every state to be the same or zero or something like that, right? So as Bob said, you kind of need to know one payoff in every state, okay? If you don't know that payoff, then it's not a normalization. Normalization sounds much more innocuous than what that assumption is, okay? And there's some papers that have pointed this out very carefully and have shown that for certain counterfactuals, this normalization can be very important. It can give you a very different answer, okay? And so in the paper, what we do is we show that, okay, even though we're going to estimate this optimal stopping problem with the dynamic assignment and all that, there will be a particular set of payoffs to which the counterfactuals are going to be invariant. And because the counterfactuals are going to be invariant, counterfactuals in which you change the mechanism are going to be invariant to, no matter what those payoffs are, it's without loss for those counterfactuals to normalize the payoffs to zero, okay? And that statement has to be in regard to a class of counterfactuals that I'm considering, not a general statement, okay? Second, there's going to be some complexity. There's going to be a dynamic game with 100,000 players. And so there's going to be some complexity about the beliefs, the state space. There's some complexity about the past offers that I got and what that means about where I'm on the list. And we have to simplify the state space in a certain way. And that's also another common thing that happens in dynamic games, right? Ariel talked about it a bit, where you potentially have these very high dimensional set of actions that all of your competitors are doing what you're doing, all the information that you have from the past, etc., that could inform all of your beliefs, right? And so you have to simplify the problem because otherwise you get into this curse of dimensionality that makes it kind of painful. And then we want to do dynamic mechanism design from an empirical perspective, so to solve for equilibria, right? And that has another set of issues. Okay, so those are three things that we're going to kind of do in service of thinking about how alternative mechanisms would perform in the kidney assignment cell system. Okay, now these three types of things, pretty much in any dynamic game, you have to confront these three issues. Okay, and the solutions might be a bit different based on which type of game you're looking at. Any questions at a high level about these challenges? I'm going to get into them in some detail, but I just wanted to pause for a second. Okay, so let's talk about the model. All right. Good. So agents are going to be patient-surgeon pairs. They're indexed by I. Objects are indexed by J. They're organs. Objects have an arrival rate of lambda. Time is going to be continuous, and organ types are going to be drawn from some distribution F. Okay. So time is continuous, which is days since joining the kidney waiting list. And we're going to think of a finite horizon model in which nobody can live past 100 years of age. Rho is going to be the discount rate. It's not identified, as you know. And so we're going to fix it to a certain number. And then there are going to be a bunch of primitive payoffs. The first primitive payoff is going to be the flow payoff of remaining on the waiting list, which is, you can think of as your flow payoff from dialysis. Yes, Harry?
Why not just make it an infinite horizon problem with some failure time? I mean, that's a stationary problem.
So stationarity, I mean, the main reason why we don't want to have stationarity is that how long you've not been functioning with a kidney will have impacts on your payoffs. So that's the main reason we don't want to have stationarity, the problem be stationary. I think we could do this infinite horizon, but I don't know anybody who lives that long. Sorry?
No, with the high enough hazard rate, they'll die.
Yeah, I don't think it's like a major thing I want to sort of say that we have to make it. The finite horizon helps with computation, but it's not like a major thing. It's not super relevant. But stationarity, I do care about for the reason I told you. So there's a flow payoff from waiting on the list. on dialysis, and DIT is the net present value of departure without an assignment. And you might die, you might leave the list because you became too sick to transplant, you died, you got a transplant to the living donor list. We're going to keep departures as exogenous, so delta IT. So what that means is that the changes in the waitlist assignment mechanism is not going to, I'm going to assume, does not change your incentives for looking for kidneys elsewhere. Okay, so you could get a living donor kidney, and this paper does not consider that margin. All right, that margin might be small because living donor kidneys are much better. You know, the person hasn't already died who's giving you the kidney, and the surgery can be planned in pretty well. But you know, we don't have data linking the two, and you know, we wanted to keep problem contained. And gamma IJT is the net present value of being assigned, of I being assigned J at time t. That's going to be one of the things that we're going to be really interested in. So there's some restrictions on the payoffs. The first restriction is that we take a consequentialist approach in which you only care about what you're assigned. If you get a lot of offers, it's not that you face some cognitive cost that actually affects your welfare. It's reasonable if you think about it. If you don't have a functioning organ and you're considering whether to take a kidney or not, the cost of that consideration should be pretty small relative to what's at stake. Okay, so if a mechanism makes you consider more offers or less offers, I'm not going to think of that as important. Okay. Second, and this is an important assumption, that there is going to be no time varying unobserved heterogeneity. Okay, so it's not going to be the case that the flow payoff of remaining on dialysis or the net present value of being assigned at time t has time varying unobserved heterogeneity. Okay, and it's primarily for tractability. Okay, it's a hard problem to solve otherwise. Okay, everybody with me so far? So the mechanism and beliefs. So every agent I has a priority score for J that depends on your own type, the organ type, and how long you waited. Okay, and when a kidney shows up, the assignment is going to be to the QJ highest, so up to 2 highest priority agents that accept an organ from that donor. So most donors die and have 2 kidneys, left and right. They're pretty much the same, not exactly, but pretty much the same. And if you're the top 2 people who accept it, you're going to get offered. There's technological constraint that up to NJ offers can be made for each donor. Kidney has to be transplanted within a certain amount of time, and so we're going to keep that technological constraint as exogenous. So the procurement authorities, sorry, the placement authorities, they're going to contact a bunch of people, and if somebody says yes, then it's going to get allocated, otherwise not. Okay, within that duration of time. Yes, Berto.
That 20% that disappears, or what is the loss of all those kidneys that are?
Why did they get lost? Yeah, so very often what happens is that you try to place it and you contacted 500 people or 1,000 people, even 5,000 people, and nobody said yes, and you ran out of time. Now, you could have, in some cases, they may not have quite thought about it right. So it's possible that they should have offered a particular organ to more people than they did initially. And they offered it to 200 people, nobody said yes. By the time they got all of the responses, they'd already lost a bunch of time. And then the race against the clock doesn't work out.
Okay, so it's due to the race against the clock, not because nobody wants it.
It's both, but there's some margin because the race against the clock. Okay. And so I can get a compatible object J. So Cij is whether you're compatible or not, if your priority score is higher than some cutoff priority score. So think about it as the following. Once all is said and done for a particular deceased donor, there's some patient who had certain priority score and this person got the kidney. Okay. If your priority score was higher than that, you would have received it, and if you said yes, otherwise you wouldn't. Okay, so S star J is that priority score. So what you have to do in order to think about this optimal stopping problem. So let me just pause for a second. One perspective that's often useful in these things is to put, again, yourself in the shoes of somebody playing this game. Okay, and what do I need to learn in order to make a decision? And what do I need to have beliefs about in order to make a decision? And think about yourself as an advisor to this person. Okay, so you would say, oh, you've gotten this offer. Okay, here's how much you value it. Okay, here's how good it is for you. If you say no, you're going to get some offer in the future. Let's try to form a belief about what the distribution of those offers look like, the quality of those offers look like. And let's see whether you should accept this kidney. Okay, that's how I would at least go about advising somebody, and maybe a surgeon would. Okay, and so you need to form this belief. Now, notice, since you get the offer for the kidney, if your priority score is high enough, what you need to know is the distribution of the priority scores of a kidney of a given quality in the future, right? So let pi ijt be the probability that you would be offered kidney J after you've waited for T periods, for time length of T, and you were on the list. So that pi ijt is the product of two things. First, you got to be compatible with the kidney. If you're not compatible, who cares? Okay. But if you're compatible, then there's a distribution given the kidney's characteristics, Zj, that are observed in the data, and eta J that the econometrician does not know, but the agents know. There's a distribution of this cutoff priority S star J. And I'm going to say that, okay, let's think about that distribution, and the product of those two is the probability that you're going to get offered. Now, what this is omitting in the state variable is that in the past, you got some offers. And the past offer that you got and you declined probably has some signal about where you are on the list and who else is on the list for you. Okay? And so technically, the state variable should be, or the unrestricted state variable is the history of all of the information that this agent got, which is all of the offers that they received, what they were, whether they said yes or no. And in principle, that should affect your beliefs about the offers that you're going to get in the future. Okay, we're going to omit all of that, and we're going to say there's some longer and average distribution that these guys are playing against. And, that's a strong assumption, but, we did some work to try and see if there's a gross violation of that assumption. Is it the case that past offers predicted your decision-making? The answer is no. Could we rule out autocorrelation in, can we reject zero autocorrelation in S star J? The answer is we cannot reject zero autocorrelation. And time since you got the last offer is not predictive of your future offers. So perhaps surgeons are not paying that close attention in their advising to each and every patient, that they're thinking about all of the past offers. Okay? What that does is it significantly collapses the state space. The state space goes from something that has this whole entire history to something that is much lower dimensional. Okay, it's just the distribution of S star J for each kidney type. Everybody with me with what the role of this assumption is and what that means and why it kind of helps? Otherwise, I have to estimate a much higher dimensional objects. Okay. All right. So with this primitive of how sort of the payoffs work, arrival rates work, and this assumption on beliefs, let's try to derive the value function in continuous time. So as opposed to discrete time models that you've seen so far, I'm going to think about a continuous time model. Okay, it'll allow me to think of the case where people only accept one offer at a time. It's going to make certain things simpler. So let's think about the following idea. I have an offer for a kidney, and I decide to wait, or I don't have it. I decide to wait delta T period, a small amount of extra weight. So what does that mean? So VIT is going to be, there's going to be a discount factor because I wait delta t periods, it's continuous time. I'm going to discount all the payoffs by 1 over 1 plus rho times t. There'll be a flow payoff on waiting, which is dit times delta t, plus with probability delta t times delta sub it. I'm going to depart the list and I'm going to get the value from the departure. With probability lambda times delta t, a kidney will arrive in this period, in this delta t duration. If it arrives, the probability is going to be drawn from some distribution f. Once it's drawn from the distribution f, there's some probability that I get the offer, which is given by pi ijt. And then I'm going to choose between taking the kidney, which would give me gamma ijt, and waiting. So I get the maximum of these two. Okay. Then with probability delta it plus lambda I of t, which is plus delta t. Lambda it is just the integral of these two terms here. Nothing happens. And I'll get my value function from waiting at t plus delta t. And then everything else is of order smaller than delta t. Okay. So this looks like your discretized version of a continuous time dynamic programming problem. Setting delta t to 0, if you take the limit, you get the you get an ordinary differential equation, the Hamiltonian Jacobi-Bellman equation, where if you rearrange terms, you get this rho plus the probability of the rate at which you depart the list times VIT. So there are two reasons for discounting here. One is just time preferences, and the other one is the game ends and you quit, right? Which is given by delta IT. Plus V dot, plus the flow payoff from waiting, plus the rate at which you depart times departure, plus lambda times the value of saying yes or no. Okay. If you did macro and you paid attention to your macro classes, you would have, this would look more familiar, potentially. Okay. Good. All right. So here's the ODE again. Any questions on how the ODE was derived? Okay. All right. So here's the ODE. Now, just like in the discrete choice, in the discrete time case, I need to restrict preference, some payoffs in order to make some progress. And it's common to set the payoff from each state in each action to 0, from one action in each state to 0. And it's common to have to set the discount rate. The discount rate is set because you can't identify it. You can rationalize everything using a static model. So the normalizations in one is not necessarily without loss of generality, as I said. And to give you like some sense of why it's not without loss of generality, what might happen is that if you change the counterfactual, the transitions to the various states might change, right? And when the transitions to the various states might change, the continuation values will change. You've set that, you know, the value of a particular action from every state is the same or 0. And if you've done that and the transitions to these states change, then that affects the value function in the counterfactual. Okay, that's kind of a rough intuition for why the normalization is not really a normalization. Okay, so we need to find one normalization. We need to find something, because otherwise we can't make progress. Okay, and what we are interested in doing is to change the assignment system. Okay, and we want to say that we want to have predictions, and we want to make sure that the counterfactual is identified. That if I identify everything else in the model, I can still identify the counterfactual. Okay, subject to a restriction in the model. Okay, and so what do I do? What do? We normalize the net present value of rejecting every offer from now until 100 years of age to 0. No matter what the mechanism is, you can always take this action. You can always say, we're going to only consider mechanisms in which we don't force you to take a kidney, right? So if you can always decline a kidney. if you always have the value, if you always have the option to decline the kidney, let's think of the sequence of payoffs you get there and normalize that to 0. Okay. And say the payoff from remaining on the list does not change. So cost and benefits of dialysis, which is always an option for these patients, does not change, which seems reasonable. Why would the change in the mechanism change how good dialysis is, right? Probably not much. And second, this one's a little bit more of a restriction in this context, is that the value and the rate of departures from the deceased donor list does not change. Okay, so saying that the death and live donor transplantation doesn't change. So if there's an extensive margin here, then that could violate this assumption. So if you do that, what you get is, and you have to do a little bit of math for that, is that the terms that say DIT plus delta IT times capital DIT, that the terms here, right here, these terms all become 0. Okay, and they drop out. Okay, and once they drop out, this ordinary differential equation can be rewritten as the following integral equation. Okay, it's an integral equation because v is on the left-hand side and v is on the right-hand side. Okay, and it's basically a continuous time analog of something like what you've seen before, where there's a v on the left-hand side, and then there is EV conditional on taking the maximum value, the optimal action in every period. Okay, but the d terms have dropped out because of this normalization. You have to work through the math to see why it's a normalization in the paper. I'm not going to go through that, but I just want to point out, because this is the dynamic structural econometrics conference. You need to think about this carefully for your empirical example. Okay, so I've got this integral equation. Okay, so I got that. So now let's take a look at this integral equation. Okay, sounds still hard. I took an ordinary differential equation, turned it into an integral equation. Why did I do that? Seems like a waste of time, right? Equally hard to do, but actually it turns out to be very, very empirically tractable. So what are the terms in here? There's rho, that's the discount rate. We know that's not identified. I'm going to set that to 5% per year, do a robustness sensitivity analysis with respect to other things. Then there is lambda, which is the rate of arrival of kidneys into the deceased donor list. I see that in the data. So I see how often kidneys show up. So I take the empirical average. That's the maximum likelihood estimator if I have exponential arrival. So I'm not losing any information. Then I have the probability that I will survive until period tau, conditional on I living at time t. That's the rate at which you're going to remain on the list. Okay, so you could take a proportional hazards model and you can estimate that, right? There's no unobserved heterogeneity in this, persistent unobserved heterogeneity in this model. So I'm going to estimate that separately. Okay, and it turns out that the Gompetz hazard model has a pretty good fit and a fit very similar to the Cox proportional hazards model. So we'll use that. Okay, so we'll take delta IT equals xi beta plus p times t, where p is the shape parameter in the Gompetz model. So I've got all of these things, and what that leaves me with is this inner integral. Okay. Now let's play with that inner integral. Okay. So this inner integral has something called pi, which is what offers I can expect to get, and this max between the two. Okay. Good. So how do I do that? I'm going to take, it's a binary choice model, right? So I accept or reject a kidney. So I'm going to estimate the CCP. I'm going to parameterize gamma minus v using this functional form. There will be some basis functions that interacts x's and z's with theta. There'll be donor unobserved heterogeneity a to j, and then there'll be some epsilon ijt. Okay, it's high dimensional. If it was low dimensional, I could have done a frequency estimator by binning things. But I wanted to have some richness. We wanted to have some richness here, so we'll directly parameterize this. Think of it as, I mean, you could claim that this is semi-parametric by calling chi sort of basis functions or whatnot, but I think that there are some restrictions in the way we parameterize it. So that's the truth of it. So it's some piecewise linear forms, etc. So we can estimate this You can take your favorite estimator. We did MCMC because Paul and I have fun with doing that. So why not? So anyhow, there's this eta-j term, which is a donor envelope heterogeneity, right? And think of that as being identified as in a measurement error model because each donor has 2 kidneys. So you get 2 measures of decisions. So that's sort of how we think about that being identified. Okay, so now subject to identification of conditional choice probabilities, what I can do is I can then go to our favorite Hotz-Miller inversion. And we can say that the expected max of gamma ij minus v is phi of pijt. So Hotz-Miller inversion, you learned about two days ago. Okay, so I do Hotz-Miller inversion. And so now let's look at my inner integral again. I've got my inner integral where I've got pi ijt times the max of these 2 terms integrated. Okay, for the max of these 2 terms integrated, I'm going to substitute the Hotz-Miller term. Okay, phi of p. Once I've identified p, I'm good. And then what I need to do is to figure out this pi thing, right? Well, the mechanism is such that, remember, pi is 1 if Sijt is bigger than the cutoff. Okay, so let's just use the empirical analog of this integral to get this. Okay. So what we did was we basically did a little bit of math with the initial model and showed you constructively how the model is identified subject to setting those things to 0. And as a separate side note, we said that setting those things to 0 is without loss for our counterfactuals. So therefore, I've argued that our counterfactuals are identified. And I've constructively showed you how to identify it essentially, okay, which is there are 2 types of proofs of identification. Some proofs are constructive and some proofs show that the inverse map exists. And when the proof is constructive, one value of that is that it could suggest an estimator directly, right? And so when you think about Whitney's condition of identification, did not specifically say whether that condition was motivated by a constructive proof or an existence of an inverse proof. Sometimes the constructive proof has some value because it can suggest an estimator. Okay, so that's what we did here. Okay, good. And so you can go ahead and estimate the model as such. Okay, any questions about all the steps here? Okay. All right, but you know, it's like replacing a bus engine. Not very far from it. Okay. Okay, good. So let's look at the estimates and some of the counterfactuals we're going to do. So one of the challenges, and you know, when Dan said the favorite part of his paper was, one of his favorite parts of the paper was to think about this question about how to compare utility. That was one of my favorite parts of his paper too, because the thing that happens in these matching mechanisms is that you don't have a numeraire like money that you can use to do interpersonal comparisons, right? And so in market design, we will often face this, that there isn't a numeraire, and so you can't appeal necessarily to Kaldor-Hicks criteria to justify things. So it can be a bit difficult to think about what are the relevant units of interpersonal comparison. In school choice, we thought about distance. Dan had a beautiful way of thinking about transferring across in the income distribution, etc., and based on need for public housing. And here we're going to think about the following quantity. Take a individual and ask the following question: if they get a particular kidney, or if you change the mechanism, how much better off they are in the terms of these value functions? Okay. That gives you an answer in the units of these value functions, which don't really have an economic interpretation. Okay, and then you can ask yourself the following question: if instead I could do something to the organ allocation system that increases the supply of donors, okay, that would increase the supply of donors and the patients would be better off, right? because there'd be more kidneys going around. Okay. What's an equivalent change in the donor supply that makes the patient as well off as the change in the value function from a particular policy? It's kind of like an equivalent variation. And that's how we are going to map, that's how we're going to think about the units here, okay? To make it more economically interpretable and something to make it more interpretable for policymakers. And tomorrow we'll get into, or actually later today, we'll get into some other things that policymakers also care about beyond just these kinds of notions like life years from transplantation in the kidney context or student achievement in the school context. So that tells you, the figure here shows you this quantity. That if you take a one-time offer of a patient for a patient of a particular type of donor, donors aged between 18 to 34, 35 to 49, or above 49, and you ask yourself for different types of patients, what is the equivalent increase in the donor supply that would make the patient indifferent between that increase and a one-time offer of a particular type of donor? That's what this is plotting. And for 70-year-old patients, we find that, across all patients, we find that younger donors are more valuable. Okay, so if you give an offer for a younger donor, they like it more. The younger donors tend to have better kidneys, right? And that's going to function longer in a patient's body, and that's always better. A 70-year-old patient is going to benefit more from an offer than a 40-year-old patient. These 40-year-old patients can wait longer. Potentially, their dialysis is not doesn't take as much of a toll, and so the 70-year-old patients are going to value it more. If the donor has no mismatches in terms of particular protein, then with a patient, then that's more valuable to them. Okay, so you get some estimates like this, and you can talk to doctors about it and what they think about it. And one of the things that you see in this picture is that donor heterogeneity is particularly important. Patient heterogeneity is also important, but the match-specific heterogeneity may not be as important. Okay, your question?
No questions.
Okay, so now we've got these estimates, and the new challenge is how do we use these estimates to predict what would happen in a counterfactual world? Okay, and we're going to use the notion of a steady state equilibrium. I'm not going to define it very formally in the talk. You can look at the paper for a formal definition. We are going to impose three requirements. The first is agents are going to make optimal decisions, basically use that dynamic programming problem that I laid out, subject to whatever beliefs pi star they have in equilibrium. Second, pi star is consistent with the strategies and the composition of the list. So given the strategies of all the agents, how many agents there are in the list, and what the composition of the agents are, you have pi star that is implied by all of these things. And third, we're going to say that the Q is in steady state. Okay, so there's going to be Q length n star that's going to satisfy a detailed balance condition that the arrival rate of agents into the Q is equal to the departure rate of agents in the Q. And then the composition of the Q is given by the survival curves implied by the strategies and the departure rates. And to solve for this equilibrium, we basically did an iterative procedure, iterated best response kind of procedure. We used backwards induction to solve for the value function. That's one place where the finite horizon assumption helped us, as opposed to a transversality condition or something like that. So that was a computational reason for doing that. Then second, you can compute given everything else, you can compute the pi's by essentially thinking about it as, a sort of a Poisson, a failure model. There's an approximation in the paper. And then the detailed balance condition and the survival curve calculated gives you the answer. So we solved this by first discretizing the problem a bit. So to make the computation a little bit easier to do. Okay. So in some sense, it's kind of using all of the tools that you learned in the first two days, right? From estimation of the dynamic problem in various ways to sort of the discussion that Bertel and Fedor had about how to solve for equilibria, and all of these tools sort of came together for this practical problem. Okay, steady state. So it abstracts away from transition dynamics. Okay, so that's a limitation of this this approach. So if you change the Q today, it might take a while for things to equilibrate, and you'll miss potential change during the transition dynamics. Okay, and that's kind of a common thing in these setups, and one might want to think about that carefully if you think the transition dynamics are particularly slow. Okay, so we're interested in market design or mechanism design here, and so we're going to think about the various mechanisms. We're going to think about mechanisms that maximize aggregate welfare, some Pareto weights times the value function for all current and future generations of potential kidney patients in these equivalent units. Okay, and then we think about optimal assignment, which is, let's say that you were an oracle and you knew all the payoffs, and so you just but you did have some uncertainty about when people are going to arrive, etc. So there will be steady state conditions, but there will be no agent optimality. You could force people to take whatever kidneys. That's a theoretical benchmark. It's not realistic. It's trying to see how far you can get and how far do our mechanisms get relative to that. The optimal offer rates. So you can offer people kidneys, but you can't force them to take the kidney. So it quantifies the how much welfare you need to sacrifice because of this incentive constraint that agents have to be incentivized to take the kidney, as opposed to you can force them to take the kidney relative to the optimal assignment. Second, approximately optimal priorities. So it could be that the optimal offer rates are not implementable because you have to figure out, okay, who gets what offer at what rates, but instead, what the designer wants is to have a waiting list in which there are priorities. Okay, you can't just go about offering people in certain ways. And then finally, like, these things might have distributional consequences, and distributional consequences have a real, can potentially create real constraints. So if you think about reforming the kidney allocation system, you'll propose a reform, and then there'll be a period of public comment where all of the people who are potentially affected by this reform have some ability to comment on it, and some people might really object. Okay, and so if you can improve, if you can have a Pareto improvement, you're more likely to be able to garner support for potential reform. So look at that. So here's what we found. On the horizontal axis, I've got the reduction in the fraction of kidneys discarded. Remember, 20% of kidneys were discarded. And the question was about, are these all being discarded because they're timing out, or some of these are really bad kidneys, or what? Is there some intensive margin that we can play with? And that is going to be without changing the technological constraint of the number of offers. And on the vertical axis, I've got this equivalent increase in the donor arrival rate if you change the mechanism. Okay. The current priorities that were used in the sample and the post 2014 priorities give you very similar answers. It didn't really seem to do much. And people realized this later, and that is why we are potentially doing another reform in 2024. First come, first serve is a bit worse on reduction in fraction discarded. Remember, it makes people selective. Okay, it does a little bit better on the donor arrival rate, but you might say it's not worth it. Okay, if you did greedy priorities, you'd get a little bit better on this without sacrificing discards. But if you designed it more cleverly, you could do a lot better on both dimensions. Okay, in principle. And then last come, first serve puts a gun to your head, better accept a kidney. So it does really well on discard rates, but sacrifices match quality because you'll take whatever. You won't you won't take matches that are idiosyncratically better for you. Okay, we don't have a way of aggregating these two dimensions. Okay, because discard rate versus welfare and matching, not so clear which way you should trade those off, what the indifference curves on that look like. Okay, and that's another feature or bug of mechanism design, which is there will be lots of objectives that as a real world market designer you'd want to satisfy. Irene theoretically talked about some of these, right, using the theory. Strategy proofness, maybe Pareto efficiency, stability, etc. And they're often in conflict with each other, right? And as opposed to what we often do in other areas of economics, there's a welfare function that and constraints that determines what you should do. They're going to be often these multiple dimensions that are not easy to aggregate. And from theory won't tell you, economic theory won't tell you how to trade those off. Okay, and often a market designer is going to tell you what are the trade-offs between these dimensions without taking a clear stance on a particular recommendation. Okay, and I often find that approach to be productive when talking to policymakers, because they don't necessarily want to always go back to utilitarian objective functions. Okay, so it's not a theoretical claim, it's more of a claim based on experience. So I'm going to conclude by saying that this dynamic assignment problem is intractable from a theoretical perspective and requires an empirical approach where building on the tools that you learned in the first 2 days, there's some progress in this dimension. Kurt is working on another dynamic assignment problem that adds much more flavor to this with heart allocations. You should talk to him about that if you're interested. There are going to be some other papers in the conference talking about dynamic assignment systems. That'll be kind of interesting to see what you guys think about that. And I think that in general, I hope in your discussions you found lots of examples where waitlists are used. And I'm going to guess that there's not a lot of economic analysis of that stuff. So hopefully you could contribute to this area by thinking about how to design these types of systems. Okay, so that's it. I have a couple minutes for questions, but I don't want to keep you too long for lunch. I know everybody's hungry. I am hungry for sure. Yes.
So just going back to your point about the numeraire and these matching problems, is that because you don't have like a price and utility function?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So the standard thing that, a common thing that we do as economists is to say that let's try to estimate people's trade-off between money and something else. And then if there is a new allocation where somebody is better off and somebody else is worse off, okay, what we could do is we could have the person who's better off potentially compensate the person who's worse off. And if there is such a situation where there's a potential transfer that results in a potential Pareto improvement, then we tend to advocate for those potential Pareto improvements. This criteria is known as the Kaldor-Hicks criteria. Okay, when there's money involved, it's fairly clear how to engage in that exercise, at least conceptually. Now, practically implementing a potential Pareto transfer is a different question, right? I can't think of many situations where that happens, where we do a reform and then we compensate the losers, because there are incentive issues in there are information issues in identifying who exactly the losers are, and if there's some revelation system that you want to get their private information in order to compensate the right losers, that creates a whole set of other incentive issues that we don't usually talk about, right? So there are very few examples of it, but nonetheless, we are used to thinking about these potential Pareto improvements as a way of justifying a utilitarian welfare function, okay? And here, there is no transfer whatsoever. So that usual exercise cannot be, the usual logic cannot be used to justify this kind of approach. Okay. Now, whether it's practically relevant or not, I probably am in disagreement with much of the economics profession. Yeah.
I was struck in your figure that there's still a lot of gap in the first breast allocation, and I wanted to know whether you could achieve that by penalizing people who reject a proposed offer, like putting them back in the queue.
That's what last come first serve does, right?
Well,
So
not going all the way there.
not going all the way there. Yeah.
In other words,
So-
pushing them back a few
Right.
rungs in the queue.
Yeah. So we didn't consider that. It's a good question. Partly why we didn't consider that is because then your previous actions become a state variable,
Okay.
because then it affects your priorities in the future. And if you remember the empirical application, we didn't have that in the model that we estimated. And so, we'd have to make some assumptions in order to get there, but that's one of the reasons we didn't consider that.
Would there be any other way to get closer to that optimal assignment payoff? You think of?
It's a great question for research. So the optimal offer rates tells you what you can do without penalizing people. That's the best you can do without penalizing people. Like if you say that if you reject something, there's no consequences for what you do, that's the theoretical optimal you can do. So that's also one interpretation of those 2 points that are somewhere in the
And if you brought in money or something to subsidize them, say we're gonna offer you $5,000 to do it, you'd also have to change your model, I guess, to put it.
Yes, then I need to be able to measure the trade-off between money and organ quality. Okay. I don't want to keep you from lunch. Thank you.